Thanks a lot for attending. These have been, I think, a good diversion for everybody, and even Steve and I. We've been very pleased with the response we've been getting. You know, the number of people that are showing up for these little informal talks, and also the wonderful emails we get afterwards. I kind of unleashed I don't know, kind of opened the Pandora's box when I said, oh, if we don't get to your questions next week or in this talk, go ahead and send me emails and I'll answer them. And I don't know how many hours I spent answering emails after our last talk because we couldn't get through everything. So, but we do enjoy interacting with you folks. You know, you are part of this whole family that we've tried to build. And we think it's really important that, you know, we can have this connection. As I think you know well by reading what Steve and I have written, both in the books and on the website. And we really try to downplay any sort of pretense, and you know, we want to interact with folks. So we certainly don't consider ourselves on any sort of pedestal, but we do look forward to being able to share information with other folks and in providing a platform for all that sharing. So with that said, let's launch into our first question, Steve.
Okay.
Excuse me, I have to find it for a second. Okay. So I think this is one that, you know, you probably get a lot, Steve. This is a person that, this is actually from Tomas, and he says, I don't have many resources to introduce me to alpine climbing in my area because most of the guides go away to work in another country during the winter season. I want to ask you if there's any written book or guides or online courses to attack the problem of developing the skills like route finding and route planning.
Yeah, you know, I think that there's a bunch of questions layered in there, how to get started and how to improve as an alpinist. You know, and I'd say probably the best school is what we would call in English the school of hard knocks, sort of the just going out and doing it and trying. That obviously takes a willing climbing partner and so forth at the same level. But I could tell you, like, I mean, I did my first big wall was actually the classic Liberty Crack on the east face of Liberty Bell. And I was, I don't know, 21 years old. And Doug and I literally like had John Middendorf's book, How to Climb a Big Wall, that was the title of it, with us. We're up there like figuring out how to rig the hauling systems and do all that stuff. And that's how we kind of figured stuff out for ourselves. I mean, there's certainly skills that you can learn, you know, when you're in quarantine, for example. You know, but there's certainly books you can read about how to do certain aspects, and you can develop certain skills like map reading or tour planning, route planning, those kinds of things. But there's no substitute for just kind of going out and trying. Of course, be conservative, be safe, but you just gotta go through it, and everybody goes through it. And I think that's one of the things that I like about this format. But I've always tried to once I had the position as a known climber, let's say, I've always made a big effort to try to make sure everybody understands that we all get experience in the same way. And I have nothing special. I have no special talent. I just had a lot of time and a lot of passion and a lot of energy and put it all into one particular thing. That's how I got to be good at it. And that's it. So
yeah, I would add to everybody who's an expert at something was a beginner once.
Yeah.
So here's another question also from Tomas. In mixed climbing, how do you know which cam sizes to take with you?
Okay, we'll get a couple gear questions out of the way. Good. So I think it's actually more relevant to kind of specific climbing areas and climbing types, like what my standard rack, for example, in the Canadian Rockies, is probably different than my standard rack in the Dolomites, is different than my standard rack in the Western Alps, is different than in Alaska and so forth. So it always depends on where you are, but I do think there are kind of standards. Depends again on where you are, but I honestly try to this is a little bit thin for most people, but I try to get by most of the time with a single set of cams up to, you know, hand size, maybe fist size, and nuts. And obviously if you need ice screws and maybe perhaps some pitons and certain rock types and those kinds of things. If you can, you know, that's obviously not very much gear for a lot of people, but you can always make the pitches shorter. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, here's a question, Steve. Someone who's probably currently locked down and can't get outside. So they're doing a lot of box step ups. And in fact, this person is using box step ups with a heavy weight and doing 2 hours per session.
Wow.
And they're coming away with a sore kneecap. What would you recommend that they do?
Well, you don't, I mean, one of the first rules of training is don't get hurt, don't get injured, right? So if you're having injury problems with any of these repetitive motions, you probably need to reduce that motion. You know, I don't know, you know, if it's the box, did you mention the height of the box? I forget. It's too high?
It's 40 centimeters, so a foot and a
Okay.
half, roughly.
That's okay. Well, you're going to need to kind of throw the kitchen sink at this sort of injury. It's often one of two things. It's most commonly tight quadriceps if you have kneecap pain. It's also very often tight iliotibial band, the IT band, the fascia on the outside of your leg. So some massage, stretching, you know, foam rolling. We've got some information about foam rolling and whatnot on the site. Any of those things is going to be good. But you want to nip that in the bud before it becomes a chronic problem.
And for someone like this, Steve, what would be the difference between them, instead of stepping up onto a 40 centimeter, or what's that, about 16-inch box, instead of doing that, what if they did 3 small steps up, like a set of stairs, and then back down?
Yeah, well, it's going to change the angle on the muscles a little bit, and the range of motion a little bit. You know, if you're going upstairs, your reach is further, so it's going to put the load a little more back in your glutes and a little less in the quadriceps. So yeah, that's that could be good to try switching up the different box angles and box heights.
Here's another, Steve. So do we have a special push-up progression training program like the 8-week pull-up progression?
Sure, that's a good question. You could actually take that pull-up progression and apply it to any exercise. You could apply it certainly to push up, and I know that Scott has actually did that with some SEALs he was training. It's hard to add weight with push-ups, so you know, if you have a weight vest, that's a great way to start. And then beyond that, you would need a partner to actually like set some weights on your back. It's not the most comfortable thing, but you can certainly use that same progression, that same theory of overload to do the same thing with any exercise.
Here's one from Vitali. He's wondering, since we talked last week about how Reinhold Mester trained himself to be able to do 1,000 meters in an hour, he's thinking not so many people can sustain that pace for 10,000 feet, I bet. Maybe you guys could share some incredible athletic feats that were clocked in the mountains to inspire the audience as to what's possible with hard work. And I think we could obviously give you some examples of our co-author, Kilian Jornet, a couple of events that he has managed to pull off. One being he holds the round trip record on Mount Blanc outside of Chamonix. And that's the vertical gain from town to the summit is, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I think it's roughly 3,500 meters, I think, something like that. And
yeah, probably slightly more.
Yeah, and on that ascent, he maintained over 1,100 meters per hour during that climb, during that ascent. And then similarly on the Grand Teton, when he set the fastest known time on the Grand Teton, he was maintaining well over 1,200 meters per hour on the ascent of that. So, I mean, it is possible for very well-trained athletes, and there's a number of alpinists that I have worked with that are certainly capable of maintaining 1,000 meters an hour for 2 or 3 hours at a time.
Yeah, and I have a little personal experience with some of that stuff, like, but not a ton. I've not been the big kind of record keeper person. It wasn't as popular a few years ago either. But I spent quite a few summers, 5, I think, summers guiding and 5 or 6 summers guiding in Chamonix. And I used to be able to go do the Friendo Spur from the base of the climbing, not from the cable car, but from the start of the climbing. And that's probably close to 2,000 meters, but I could do it. I did it once sub 3 hours, and I did it a number of times right around 3 hours. So, you know, that's a little more technical, but a lot of scrambling, pretty direct, good conditions, etc. That's a little different. I could also, you know, Scott knows, so when I used to live in Mazama with him, we would have some sort of benchmark things. And there was this, you know, it's I think shot a little surprising when people get on these higher ends of the fitness spectrum, when you're not there, of what you can do. And especially, you gotta remember, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're fit enough to go that fast, you know, you don't need much to be out for 3 hours. You can go incredibly light. So, and you can predict the weather for the next 3 hours pretty well, right? Like, you don't need to be too worried about having to bring a whole bunch of extra clothes or something like that. So there's a lot of advantages to that. Yeah, I see some texts. Yeah, the you know, 1,000 meters an hour is, you know, ideally, yeah, it's aerobic. Yeah, so yeah. Scott, you got muted
Oh,
there.
sorry, I got muted, sorry. Anyway, what I was saying is, if you can sustain that 1,000-meter pace for 3 or 4 hours, then it is an aerobic pace for you. What's this? How about our own Scott Johnston, 7,000 feet and back under 4 hours? Was that? Oh, that must have been when Colin and I did climb the Denali. Yeah.
Right.
I don't think that was. It was not any sort of record. I mean, it was fast, but it's certainly no record. And let's see. So, Steve, another question. What would you say is the most fun day you ever had in the mountains, regardless of the difficulty or the impressiveness?
I like that question because it's not the typical question I get. So one of them, Scott, actually, you were there. It was when we, I can't remember if it was the first day or the last day when we did that trip to the Bugaboos years ago. And I was climbing with our friend Alex, and Alex got like totally off route on the northeast ridge of the Bugaboos. He was over in some lichen-filled off-width way off on the left there. And you were coming up, I think, with Catherine. Were we climbing with Cat, or were you with Flash?
Were you on the rope with Alex?
I think so.
And I was on the rope with Catherine. Yeah, we were kind of gang climbing this. It's a classic route in the Bugaboos. If you haven't ever done it,
Bugaboo Spire.
Yeah, it should definitely be on your tick list. The northeast ridge of face, whatever it is, of Bugaboo. And
Alex and I were. I'm going to tell the story. Alex and I were pulling away from Scott and Catherine a little bit, and I yelled down at Scott. I think it had just been his. I think he was like, he was not even my age at this time. He was probably like late 40s, and I think maybe he just had a birthday. I can't remember, but I yelled down at him like, "What's the matter, Scott? Can't you get your wheelchair up through that chimney fast enough?" And we just had fun, and I think that's one of the days like that when you're just out with your friends and the climbing. It's just kind of romping and climbing, having fun is really great. One of the other days I would say it was really fun that I mentioned in one of the earlier shows was climbing the new route on Nasserbrock with Marco Prezel and Steve Swenson, where it was just like incredibly fun climbing, and obviously the added joy that we were kind of opening a new route sort of on site and stuff. That was great. Lots of good memories in the mountains.
Okay, next question here. Have you ever thought of going on the normal cast?
Well, I've never been invited to go on the Enormo cast, but I do get that question from quite a few people. I even know Chris Kalous, and I actually bumped into him in a coffee shop about a year ago, but no invitation has been forthcoming from him. So, you know, whatever. He knows my number.
Yep, people need to fill up his inbox with requests for Steve House on his show.
Yeah, it's a funny thing because for some reason people always ask me that, but for some reason I never get the invite. So I don't know.
I think it has something to do with your choice of attire.
Maybe.
Here's a little more serious question. This person is confused about the distinction between high intensity training, such as conventional interval training, 30-30s, that sort of thing, and muscular endurance. Can you kind of explain the difference between those and how they have different training effect?
Sure. So one of the things I would start with is remember if you look at the books and we actually talk about muscular endurance, we often will say it's a local muscular endurance or localized muscular endurance. And I think that little detail is one of the key distinctions. Muscular endurance or localized muscular endurance workouts are often focused on something like the legs, like for going uphill, when you have these, and that's the workout where you have the really heavy pack and your pace is controlled. You're going up a steep hill and your pace is limited by the muscular work that you feel your legs is doing, not by your heart and lungs, not by your aerobic conditioning. And so the focus is very local. In this case, it's the legs and the glutes and mostly the upper legs even. So with these things like 30-30s and sprints, they're like a lot more general fatigue. They're not quite as specific. And generally, I would say, like, for people who have a really high degree of fitness, they probably generally benefit more by doing, spending more of their intensity time doing hill sprints and 30-30s and things like that. People who are more kind of building up need more of the localized muscular endurance. For example, I don't think Killian does any weighted hill climbs, right? But he'll go out and he'll do these like really long intervals, sprint, zone 3 intervals, sprinting up steep hills and so forth. It has a much greater sort of systematic overall training load, and it's much harder to recover from. But he's a professional athlete. He knows his recovery well and so forth. So he can handle a lot, and he's a highly developed athlete, so he can handle a lot more of that. So hopefully that makes sense. Scott, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it. I think the big difference really is, to sort of summarize, is that we use these muscular endurance workouts, and I talked about this last time, the correct terminology should be local muscular endurance, meaning that we are trying to target local fatigue in a fairly small muscle mass. We call it local fatigue, as opposed to central fatigue. And they have a different training effect than a conventional high intensity intervals, because, as Steve just said, their training effect is very localized to those muscles that are feeling the overload. Whereas in more conventional aerobic interval training, the training effect is much more global. And as a consequence, that's what Steve was saying, when it takes longer to recover from those, really. So let's see. Okay, here's another one I think will be interesting. This person's training for a mountain trip, and he's using our 24-week plan, it looks like. Yeah. He's been seeing good results. He's had his aerobic threshold move from 150 to 164 heart rate. So that's done a great thing for him. And he's wanting to know that when should he begin to add some muscular endurance training. He said, when I get within 10 weeks of my trip, which is next January, I'm planning to add muscular endurance. And he's wanting to know, do we think that's a good idea?
What's his trip?
It's actually, in his case, it's a mountain hunting trip, but he's also a mountaineer.
Mountain hunting. Okay, so I mean that's quite similar. I also do some mountain hunting, so I can relate to that. But you're also going uphill, mostly slowly, often with a pretty heavy pack. So I would say, you know, it sounds like the plan he's got with adding the muscular endurance towards the end in the last, I forgot what you said, 10, 12 weeks.
It's 8 to 10 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be the right approach for that. Yep. Yeah, it sounds like he's right on the right track. I'm not sure what to add, actually.
No, I think follow that plan. I mean, that plan.
And if you run out, if your 24-week is expiring, or you know, you run out, like say in August or whatever, and you get to the end of it, just restart at the beginning of the base period. You could probably skip the transition period, maybe give yourself a week or two off or a couple of light recovery weeks before launching back in, just to have a mental and physical break. But yeah, sounds like you're right on the right track.
And I want to kind of emphasize that 24-week plan that we sell on the website, it's essentially takes all the information that we built into Training for the New Alpinism book, but builds the plan for you. I mean, when we first wrote the book, we didn't expect that we'd end up coaching people. As I said earlier, we didn't really expect anybody to pay any attention to the book. But when we started getting a lot of inquiries about training and questions about how to build your own training plan, we realized that we'd given out this training manual, the book, and it's fairly challenging to translate all the theory and methodology stuff that's written into the book into a workable plan. And so we did that work for you by creating this 24-week plan. And granted, it's by virtue of it being sort of a one-size-fits-all plan, it would be helpful if you can do some adjustment to it for yourself, which is also the reason we spend so much time talking about how to monitor and control your own training, so that you know when you're tired and how the training effect is what the training effect is on you. But anyway, that 24-week plan is a great plan. Works really well for lots of these kinds of things.
Great.
So Steve, here's one. I've recently moved to, this will be close to your heart. I've recently moved to Slovenia and discovered there's a very specific culture built around alpinism here, different than in Chamonix, where I was mostly climbing before. This got me thinking about how different cultures approach alpinism. And I'm curious, how have you experienced these various cultures in the climbers' attitudes around the world? What are some things that they normally don't have in common?
Great question. I could probably do an hour AMA just about this one question. Yeah, I'm familiar with both of those cultures, having spent a lot of time in Slovenia, having spent a lot of time in Chamonix, and having spent a lot of time in a lot of variety of mountain cultures. I mean, I think it's actually one of the things as Americans, at least I'd say, and I don't want to speak for our neighbors north of the border, because I think it is different up there, is with the if you're from the United States, I blame it, or attribute, I should say, to the fact that we're so geographically spread out. We don't really have a central place where all the alpinists or all the climbers live. I mean, of course, there's pockets. There's Bishop, and there's Boulder, and there's Mazama, Ridgeway, all these places. But we're pretty spread out, so it's hard to develop a culture. But it's really interesting when you go to a place like Chamonix or Slovenia and you spend a fair bit of time there. Like, it is a culture, like it, and it's hard. It took me a while to understand that. Like, if you go, another way I've explained this to people is, if you go to any of these mountain towns in the Alps, whether it's Chamonix or Zermatt, or on the other side of Mont Blanc, Courmayeur, Karls am Großglockner, the town at the foot of the Großglockner, the highest peak in Austria. I could in Slovenia, the same in the mountain towns. what's going to be at the heart of that town? What are you going to find in the center of the town? You're going to find the church, right? Because those are mostly Catholic countries, those are all Catholic countries. You're going to find the church, and in almost every case, what is right across from the church square is the mountain guide office. Isn't that interesting? Those are the two most important cultural institutions in these mountain towns, and they have been for 100+ years at least. I mean, the church obviously going back longer, but I think that that's a good way of understanding the prominence of the culture of mountain. And by mountaineering, I want to just use the broadest possible sense of that term. It could be hiking, it could be backcountry skiing, it could be alpinism, or rock climbing, or waterfall climbing, or any of these things. But it's all of this kind of going into the mountains is central to the culture of these places. And so I think that that's one really interesting way to look at it. Another thing you'll find when you start climbing in let's say international ranges like the Himalaya is you start, especially that was my first interaction with mountaineers and alpinists from the Asian nations. Japanese, Koreans love mountaineering. There's so many, I mean, and the Japanese too, there's so many Japanese and Korean expeditions going to the Himalaya every year. And they have, again, their own kind of culture. And I think it's really one of the most enjoyable parts of going to the Karakoram range or going to Nepal or whatever, is getting to know these climbers from these other cultures in the broad sense, but also other cultures from the Alpine perspective. And interesting to see how people behave. I'd say one of the other interesting things, I think, if you look at Italy, it's even regional. Like I think, the Alpine culture that exists in the Dolomites, even between different parts of the Dolomites, I think is a little different. And if you go, to Courmayeur, or if you go to Slovenia, if you go to the Matterhorn, the Italian side of the Matterhorn, it's always just a little bit different, and they have slightly different histories, slightly different approaches, and I think that's really interesting. I'll just conclude that because I could talk for a long time about this, is the culture in Slovenia, which I really have a ton of respect for, and I really enjoy their perspective, I guess, or I guess I associate or connect and admire and appreciate their perspective. And part of that is that people don't think too much about the Julian and Kamnik Alps, the two main mountain ranges in Slovenia, but they're not very big. They're not very high. The highest mountain is Triglav, which is 2,864 meters, something like that. It could be slightly off. But it's like 9,000 feet, a little over 9,000 feet. But it's in a national park. There's no cable cars. When you park at the parking lot, I mean, you've got over 6,000 vertical feet between you and the summit, and quite some distance as well. So there's this, and if you talk to the mountaineers of the generation of basically my age and a little older that grew up in Yugoslavia, I mean, they all grew up going into the mountains by taking public transportation, and they didn't have cars, so they would walk up the road for 15 miles. They would only be able to get the bus to the where the little mountain road went up to get to the trailhead, so they'd have to walk another 10-12 miles just to get to the trailhead. So they have a different kind of appreciation for that, and the mountains are difficult to climb in. The rock is not very good in most places. It takes a different attitude. You have to kind of slow down. It's not about just like, whereas in Chamonix with the access and the quality of the rock, it's easy to do things fast and it's kind of flashy and it looks cool and stuff. But in Slovenia, it's a little bit different. It's a little more it's higher risk. It's a little more, I think cerebral is a good word. And it's just frankly, I think, more difficult place to climb. So it creates a different type of alpinist that I think is more patient, less worried about things like conditions, because if you get all that energy to get halfway up there, if conditions aren't perfect, you're still going to keep going because it's what you got. Whereas if you're in Chamonix, conditions aren't perfect. Just bust back down the cable car and come back next week because it, just costs you a lift ticket to find out. I think there's some pretty interesting differences, and I think that's a great question. And improving or tightening up the kind of culture around alpine climbing is something I would like to hope that this community is being part of. I mean, we're coming at it from the training perspective primarily, but I think it does bring a lot of people together, and I appreciate that. So thank you all for being part of that.
So back to one that's a little more training oriented, Steve. Here's someone who's using your Eiger North Face training plan and has a couple questions. So, and this I think we can talk about also in general. So he's asking that on the days in which a strength workout plus an additional ice climbing workout is planned, should they be done in a certain order, just one after the other, or one in the morning, one in the afternoon, that sort of thing?
Okay. In this case, because the strength is a little more kind of full body general strength, and the ice climbing strength is, it's grip and pull up and lock off strength. So those things are not super related. So I would probably do them in one workout, but I would do the one just look at the general, sort of from the principles viewpoint, do the part of the workout where you want to have the highest quality first. So if you want to emphasize the quality of the upper body grip, pull up, lock off, ice climbing stuff, do that first. If you feel like you need to emphasize the quality of the other strength exercises that are addressed, do those first. But I would probably do those together. They don't tend to overlap. We do, with some of our rock climbing training plans, recommend a certain workout is done in the morning and a certain workout is done in the afternoon to give some recovery time in between, because we're dealing with the same muscle groups, and we want to have that recovery spacing for recovery. But in the case of that plan, and generally speaking, and most of our other plans, I just do the quality one first, the one you want the best quality from first, and then move into the second one.
Great, thanks. And when it comes to extending one of our training plans, how would you recommend that people do that? Because we often get this kind of question, and there's one in here like that. I'm sort of paraphrasing right now, but this question is about extending a plan. And we can use the same principles for shortening a plan, but we'll often have people say, well, I want to use your 24-week plan, but I've got 32 weeks until my trip. How do I apply that plan? So what would you say to that, Steve?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to look at it. I'd say if you're a little bit newer to organized structured training, and or you feel like your fitness isn't very high, then repeat the plan or stretch out the base period, the base building period. And you can do that by repeating those blocks. Depends on the plan, but they're typically like a 4-week block where it'll be a 3 weeks build and then a recovery. So you could just take one of those blocks and do it again. Or you could take some of those weeks and double them up. So, if there's a 12-hour week, then you could repeat another 12-hour week. You can't do that indefinitely because you need to have a recovery week. So you'll have to use your head a little bit there. If you're a more advanced athlete, you probably could repeat or emphasize more the end part of the training plan where there's more specificity, there's more muscular endurance work, and that would probably be the best choice for someone who's a little bit higher level athlete. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Scott?
No, I think that's it. Perfect. And likewise, I would say, with regards, we sometimes get folks who come to us with questions about, well, I want to use, X, Y, or Z plan, and I'm aerobically deficient, but I only have, 8 weeks until my trip to Denali or Rainier or whatever it is. And as everybody listening in here knows, and as we've written, literally tens of thousands of words about this aerobic deficiency and how important we think it is for most people to their first order of priority should be to correct aerobic deficiency. And as you probably all know, that's done by a lot of low to medium intensity aerobic training. However, if you're heading off to a big mountain and you're going to be needing to carry a big pack steeply uphill, even if you are aerobically deficient, at some point in your training, you will need to begin to add that higher intensity work, even if you haven't corrected your aerobic deficiency. So what I will tell folks when they come to us with these short time horizons before some fairly major event for them is, even if they're aerobically deficient, they got to start piling on some of this more specific muscular endurance work, or they're going to end up being quite unprepared. They may not be they certainly won't be as well prepared as if they had 20 weeks of preparation. But just want to make it clear that if you came to me and you said, I'm going to use your 24-week plan, but I've only got 6 weeks before my trip, and I've never trained in my life, I'd say, okay, do the last 6 weeks of that plan, because that's going to probably help you the most on that trip. Okay, next question here. Okay, in your book, Training for the New Alpinism, you often mention that you drink a replacement shake on an expedition. Is there a certain brand of these that you like, or do you have any recommendations? Have you made any of this kind of thing by yourself?
Yeah, I've tried a number of different things. I've used, for the one I've used the most probably historically is this one called Spiz, which is one that you can find it in some cycling shops, SPIZ. One I don't like the flavor and texture as much is a Perpetuum product called Perpetuum, or sorry, a Hammer Nutrition product called Perpetuum. Then most recently I've been using a product from Gnarly Nutrition. It's a vegan recovery meal, or not recovery, a vegan meal replacement. I'm not vegan, but it's a nice texture, nice flavor. So I've been using that. And I've also made a number of my own concoctions. I mean, one of the classic, you'll hear about, people drinking chocolate milk. I mean, that's got sugar, it's got protein, it's got fat. It's not a bad, cheap, readily available recovery drink.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, so in many of the talks, and I think we touched on this in one of our very recent Zoom talks that we did, when you talk about gear, you're a big proponent of synthetic insulation. And when helping design the high Alpine kit for Patagonia, how come down was used for the park and sleep system? Do you believe the new technologies in down and fabrics have made down the new go-to?
The short answer would be no. The long answer is a little more complicated. The high Alpine kit that we did for Patagonia, the focus was really on it's like the 7,000 meter kit and so forth. And they wanted to start with down, and then the intention has always been to also introduce a synthetic sleeping system, which we will hopefully do at some point, although the current situation leaves that a little bit in question. But we always had what's called the DOS parka, and then the micro puff and the nano puff, and those are obviously synthetic insulation jackets that existed, especially in the case of the DOS, long before we made anything out of down at Patagonia. I was actually, when Patagonia first wanted to create any down jackets at all, I was a big proponent against it. I was really an advocate, saying that it was just fast fashion and that we shouldn't do that, blah, blah, blah. Well, I was wrong on a number of levels. I mean, there is a place for down in a performance world where you can dry it out. It does feel nice. We do sell a lot, so that's, I'm sure, good for the business's health and so forth. So it has a place, and obviously for warmth to compressibility ratio is incredible. The advantage of synthetic is when you're doing high output activities and you're sweaty, you put on a synthetic jacket and you dry your layers, and then that moisture, of course, moves into the jacket, and eventually, in most situations, it will move out of the jacket too. But the further the moisture gets from your body, which is the heat source, the harder and the slower it is for it to move it out back into the atmosphere. So so having that ability to dry your inner layers with your jacket and not worry about the jacket, which is your ultimate lifeline in a cold situation, not have to worry about the performance hit of that getting wet and losing its loft and not being warm anymore, is really important. The only time I really take down parkas in the mountains for more than one night is when it's incredibly cold and I don't think I'm going to be sweating, basically. And then I can deal with it. Another time is like, for example, on Denali, you have a lot of opportunities when you climb. I'm specifically talking about the West Buttress of Denali, and maybe there's a Denali question I think in here we can talk about this some more, but you have a lot of opportunities. It's cold, first of all. You don't tend to have to walk around in your down jacket, second of all. And third, except on summit day. And third, like, you have a lot of opportunities to dry things out. You spend a lot of time in camp, and things get really warm in the tents, and you can dry sleeping bags and parkas and stuff like that out really easily. On an alpine climb where you don't have a tent and it's maybe spin drifting and you're shoving your jacket in and out of your pack, it's a totally different scenario. So synthetic is still the way to go for that.
And so Steve, has the DOS parka been replaced, and if so, by what?
The DOS parka has not been replaced. It's still
okay. It's still available.
It just got redesigned. I lose track of what seasons are what with our line because I'm working on things that are 2 or 3 years ahead, and then we have whatever's coming out in the current season. So, but the latest DOS parka is great. It's, I think, the best DOS parka we've ever built.
Great.
Somebody wrote it's fall 20. Yeah, so it might not be in the line for spring because it's a fall winter jacket.
Okay. Well, Steve, here's, I think, certainly one of my favorite questions. And so maybe you can let me answer this if you want, but you're certainly welcome to chime in. And we get this question a lot. And that is, how strong is strong enough for mountain athletes? Maybe you want to start with that and I can wrap it up.
Yeah. Nobody knows. That's the short answer. I think, the best advice in this case is the answer to this question is how strong is strong enough. And generally people are asking about general strength, like how much do I need? What should be my benchmark for the deadlift? What should be my benchmark for the back squat? Those kinds of things. Thousands of studies have been done on this and there's no answer. And we have not seen I have not seen a super strong correlation between, particularly really basic, I mean basic from the technical sense, not basic from the, in another way, but basic movements like back squat, deadlift, those kinds of things, have not seen a strong correlation between that and sport performance. If you have a strong strength background, it's almost, in most people, they're almost always are going to be better off spending their time on their aerobic fitness and just trying to not as much time on strength. If it's the other way around, a lot of times we get runners and they've done tons of running, but they're actually not very strong. So putting them in the gym and building up some general strength gives us an easy way to get them some more foot speed, because speed comes from power and power is related to strength. But so it really depends. I think if I think back on my own training, as many of you know, Scott coached me for a 10-year period. I don't think I got up to around like a 2x body weight deadlifts, those kinds of range, which is pretty strong. But once I kind of got up to there, I felt like it was more than enough. Like I didn't feel like working more on that was really what was going to get me to the next level with my sport, with alpinism. So we tend to spend a lot more time and put a lot more emphasis on what I would call more functional strength for athletes that are a little bit down the development path. if you're coming from a point of no fitness and no training background, yeah, we need to start with some basic, and like I said, basic technical exercises like back squat or so forth, or goblet squat, or some of these even more. But we tend to emphasize things like split squats, lunges, hill sprints. That's also strength. A hill sprint is strength training. It just happens in a different environment. So, man, I'm getting a little bit into a rabbit hole, so I'll stop and let you, Scott.
I'll go down a different rabbit hole with that. No, I think we get this question so much about strength training that I think it's worth elaborating and, going down a few little rabbit holes with it. So I think what Steve brought up, the fact that, no one really does know how strong enough is. And by that, what we really mean is, at what point does general strength training, for instance, these general strength training exercises that you do in a gym, like deadlift or squats, or even pull-ups for climbing, whatever, those would all be categorized as kind of general strength training. At what point does increasing your general strength stop transferring over to better performance in the event or the sport you're training for? And that's really the kind of the elaboration of what Steve was just saying about how nobody really knows. I mean, I think it's quite obvious to look at the extremes in this case. I mean, if somebody comes in, who wants to be a rock climber and they can't do one pull-up, then yeah, they probably should be doing some general strength to improve that. But if someone comes to us who's, had, like in particular, this person's question, John, has a 10-year background in weightlifting, chances are that guy is way stronger than he needs to be for most of these, way stronger in a general sense because of all these general weightlifting exercises that he's been doing. And so he would be a candidate for, I mean, probably, I'm not sure, John, your background, but there's a good chance people who come to us with really high level or a high volume of strength training in their past often are aerobically deficient. So I would say that your time might be better spent on working on aerobic capacity. You probably don't need to be going in the gym and doing deadlifts. And if you do need to be doing strength training, it should be strength training that looks a lot like your event. And we touched a little bit on hill sprints last week, and Steve just mentioned them here. And I think that I want to, because I think people don't understand it quite as well as we'd like it to be understood, is that there's no more specific strength training for a mountain athlete than sprinting uphill steeply. Now, for mountaineers, that might be done, on a very, very steep terrain, like 30+%. But for mountain runners and ski mountaineers, we'll often do, hills in the range of 15 to 20% gradient. And there, if you think about these sprints, what they're using the exact kind of, I mean, the force, the increased force, instead of putting a heavier barbell on your back, is coming from the amount of power you can generate with your legs and fighting against gravity to put you uphill. And both of those things are very, very specific to any of these mountain sports that we train for. So I recommend people who are generally weak, if you can't, let's say, deadlift half your body weight, then chances are you could benefit from doing some of that general strength training. But for anyone who's a bit more advanced, we would just shift them straight into what we would call specific strength training. I hope that answers that question.
Good little dive. I think I'm seeing some messages in the chat. I know there are also a number of questions regarding from some of the older athletes in the crowd.
Oh, yeah.
We could segue into that.
Mike Gilliam just asked, in relation to strength training, do you have any additional thoughts for the over to 50, 60? Well, Mike, I can tell that you have not spent enough time on our website. Yes, being in that same age group, I'm in the over 60 age group. I wrote an article specifically addressing strength training for the aging athlete, and I think it's called Strength and Mobility Training for the Aging Athlete. So there's a ton of information in there, but in general, to answer your question, I believe, now that I'm in that, Social Security age group bracket, that us older athletes, one of the most important thing we can do is to maintain and try to increase our strength, because that's the thing that drops off the fastest, and it's going to be the thing that prevents you from maintaining an injury-free status, and it's going to be the thing that helps you do those 5-hour runs in the mountains. If you're not strong enough, then you won't even be able to go run for 4 or 5 hours. So I'm a big proponent, the older I've got, the more strength training I do. I think that there's something I like to call youthful vigor that we come out of the chute with, and we don't realize that strength that we have as young people will go away. It will diminish. And I have to work a lot harder now at strength training to even maintain, let alone try to gain strength. So yeah, I think strength training for aging athletes is definitely something we've covered extensively. Let's see here, on that same question, Steve, we talk about the mental strength. And there's a question from Alba about whether the books go into mental strength.
Yeah, I responded to Alba privately, but the new Alpinism has a whole chapter on mental strength. We didn't add that chapter into training for the FL athlete, mostly because we didn't feel like we had much more to say. And so go there, check that out. It's a good place to start. It's probably more there than what I can address here in the couple of minutes we have left. The other thing I wanted to say is I recall, to kind of put some of these other over 40 athlete questions together, is one of the things, besides prioritizing strength training, is being a little more gentle with yourself in terms of expectations. We don't respond to, I'm 49, so I know that I don't respond to training the same way I did when I was 29 or even 39, and it's just how we are. So learning to kind of, I think there's a mental lag between, typically, but especially if you're a lifelong athlete, because you're used to doing a certain set of training work, and then feeling a certain way at the end of that, and it's the outcome starts to change. So that's important. And then in terms of, I saw a number of questions come through the email about expectations in terms of climbing and so forth. A lot of people, frankly, get into climbing later in life when they're in their 40s or 50s, because they maybe have more free time, or they're suddenly in an environment, live near the mountains or something. And yeah, I think it's a matter of again, being patient with yourself, taking the long view. I think that's one of the lessons I've learned from my climbing career. And this really hit home actually in a conversation when I was out skate skiing with Scott, that Scott may not remember, that we had years and years and years ago, like, over 20 years ago, probably around 20 years ago, that where we were talking about how long an athlete can develop, and an endurance athlete can continue to improve and develop for 10, 20 years. And, so I think as we that kind of shifted my whole perspective, not just around my fitness, but also around my climbing goals, and thinking like, okay, if I'm going to be stronger, if I have goals that I'm not physically and mentally prepared for now, but I may be in 10 years, that kind of gives me something to shoot for, and it gives me a way to pace myself as well. And I think as we get older, pacing ourselves, kind of a balance between pacing ourselves and making sure we make the trips happen, that we actually get to tick off some of the things we want to do. So hopefully that helps address. There's a bundle of those kinds of questions. So hopefully I hit some of that.
Here's another one that we often get, Steve, and I think this is perfect for kind of a story. Can you talk about how you were able to do all those big, enormous routes, multi-day and that sort of thing on so little food, just a few goos and some dried potato soup for 40-hour climbs?
Yeah, sure.
Kristen is asking that.
Yeah, and that's a question I've got a lot, and I've actually told the story. We did the Slovak Direct is maybe the most famous example of that, but basically all the single push climbing I did in Alaska, as well as in the Himalaya and the Karakoram and the Alps. I did all this way. But a lot of the background is on the website. If you and we talk about it in both the books about fat adaptation and fasted training. That's the roadmap, the fasted training, and not really addressing any kind of dietary manipulation at all. I never really did that to a very large degree at all, just a slight one, and that's all explained on the website and in the book. So I don't want to spend too much time there. But I do think it's interesting to realize these adaptations, and I think this goes back to my earlier, what I was just talking about, is they do take time, because you're actually changing your physiology to a certain degree, and it takes a long time to change, and you don't do it all the time and every day. I'm not, yes, I went for 60 hours on 40 packets of goo and a couple of shakes and some soup. But I was like out for months. Like I was like, I couldn't do anything physically, aerobically. Like it was like as if the equivalent would be a ultra runner that ran their A race for the year, and then they're just so depleted afterwards that they can't really do much. Like they just can't do really anything for at least a month. So that's very, very common. So with all these kind of climbs, that's another part of how to think about it. The roadmap is there in the books and on the website in terms of the fasted training and the small amount of dietary manipulation that we have found and others have found that work. And again, this is nothing, as we always say, this is nothing we invented. This is all what people have been doing for decades, frankly, in other sports, other endurance sports. So it's all pretty well understood stuff. So I'll just kind of leave that one there, because I think we're about an hour now, and I know a lot of people have to go and so forth.
We have time for one more, maybe, just to, let's see.
Well, just Colin's question. Yeah, the keto is just, we do go into that on the website. It's too hard to stay on, and it compromises recovery for endurance athletes, and it's just, and there's no real benefit. Like you're better off just like being a little more balanced in your life and your diet. And the actual adaptations happen from the training that you do and the fueling you do during and before and during your training more than do. And I know there's guys like Ben Greenfield and these guys that are always like tweaking things. And I think one thing to remember when you look at guys like Ben Greenfield, some of you may know him, he's kind of a triathlon guy, and he always goes down these kind of nutrition rabbit holes. Yeah, if you're like, trying to eke out a 0.5% more, or 1 minute more, and you're trying to get under 9 hours for your Ironman triathlon or whatever that is, like, yeah, you might need to like fine tune these screws just slightly. 99.9% of people, including me, we just need to improve. It can get on a continual path for improvement. And what we have to do for that is much less extreme than measuring our insulin every hour all day for 7 days in a row, or, getting into all these little rabbit holes. So let's stick to the fundamentals, and you're going to get 98% of the benefits, and then you can worry about like the fine little things. That's my little diatribe on that.
Steve, I think I want to double down on what you just said, that I think many people try to, especially today in this sort of fast-paced world that we live in, and all these articles that get written about biohacking and this and that and the other thing, and some of those, they may work, and they may even provide 0.1% change in how you perform. But what Steve just said is, do the basics. I've coached world champions, Olympians, some of the best alpinists in the world, and they mainly just do the basics. And when I think about some of the really high level guys and some of the specialized training that I've done with them, that type of stuff makes up probably less than 1% of their training volume. mean, I'm talking, very, very specialized training that we would design. And that's because for those people, we were trying to extract, the last 0.1% or 0.5%, because that's what made the difference between, being on the podium and not being on the podium. But in general, and I would say it's more like 99% of us just need to do the basics.
Is there a question that we haven't hit on, Scott, that we should close out on?
Let's see. Well, we are kind of running out of time here. Well, here's someone, and again, this goes back to the strength thing, but maybe it's a question that people have with regards to, here's a person who would like to do 1 day a week, adding some track workouts. And I'd assume you're going to go run on a track there. That must be because you're wanting to do speed work. And are there benefits or pitfalls? And I would say, if you're training for our mountain sports, the kind of stuff that we normally deal with, then I would highly recommend you do that kind of speed and power training on an uphill. So with our hill sprints or longer uphill intervals, whatever, but do it on more specific training. There are certainly benefits to being able to run fast on flat ground, but I don't think you'll find that they transfer over as well to your mountain running as if you were, doing something that's more specific. Okay. Well, maybe given that we've run over just a little bit, Steve, we can wrap it up here. We do have a few more questions, and we're going to try to address these by emailing you at the end. We'll try to get back to you on those as much as we can.
And there were actually a couple of questions that came in that I thought, were also be really good forum posts. So in some cases, we may actually ask you to go, if you're willing, to post them on the forum because they do have a broader implication for more people, and they're quite good questions, and lots of people will be interested in the answers to them. And I mean, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the forums, but it's a great resource. It's been heavily trafficked, and there's a lot of posts, so it can be a little hard to find exactly what you're looking for at times, but always be willing to post there as well. So yeah, so let me see, was there one more question there, Scott?
Well, we just had a question with regards to are we planning to do any longer term tactical training plans for tactical athletes, like wildland firefighters, military types? And I would say, yes, we are. Those take kind of a lot of effort to develop. And so they're on our to-do list, but they tend to get pushed down the list as really pressing matters come in that we have to deal with.
So I'm going to take one of the questions I wanted to answer, because it was a little bit climbing related, and we could wrap it up on this. It's a little more of a philosophical question. It doesn't have a right answer. Those are the best, most interesting kinds. But there was actually there's actually two kind of questions that are a little bit, well, I'll just read this first one from Alex. And he was asking, what do you consider the better route into top-level alpinism? Being an extremely good technical climber who then learns to apply their skills to the mountains, or being someone who has always been focused on alpinism to the exclusion of a lot of non-alpine climbing? So, I would probably put myself in the latter category. And I'm going to answer, from a philosophical point of view, I think it doesn't matter. Like, I think the mountains have been the greatest positive influence in my life, and I'm not selfish about that. I think everyone should have access to that resource and should enjoy, if that's what you're drawn to, you should go there. And then it doesn't matter how you get there, and that, what you are going to need to, your weaknesses, so to speak, if you come into alpinism as a childhood bouldering phenom, or if you come into alpinism as a cross-country skier, you're gonna have different things you're gonna need to learn. And that's one of the great things about alpinism, is it encompasses such a huge number of skills and such a broad and diverse number of abilities. And not just physical abilities, but also knowledge base and so forth. That is a really all great stuff to learn, and it's a rich vein of, of life, frankly. So I don't think there is a best. I do think that it would also say that people who tend to play to their strengths, and I know I certainly did that in my career. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, but if I look back on the climbing I've done, some of the things I'm most proud of were the things that pushed me most out of my comfort zone. For example, like the North Face of North Twin was extraordinarily technical, hard, mixed climbing for a long ways in a very remote environment. And that's one of the things one of the climbs I'm most proud of doing, even though that wasn't necessarily my A+ skill set. I was better at, just hiking, kind of, let's say, classic alpinism, not as far extreme into the technical realm. So, I'm also proud of a bunch of other things I was able to do in the mountains too. So that's where I'll leave it there. I think alpinism is such a rich vein of human experience. I just encourage you all to get out and enjoy it. And by that, I mean the broadest, mountain running all the way to bouldering and everything in between. That all comes into the umbrella of alpinism in my mind. So I think we'll leave it there. If we didn't get your question today, we'll try to email you an answer, or we'll ask you to post it on the forum so we can answer it publicly there. And really appreciate everyone's participation. And see you all, same place, same time next week. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, Lisa K, I will text you. I keep forgetting.